Even though their opponent was very strong, Agatha was not going to listen to Edward this time and just watch the fight from the sidelines. Edward did not understand why his father had come here and why he had taken with him all the strongest fighters of the clan. But it seemed that Henry had long ago figured out Alfred's plan, and now had to reveal to Edward the bitter truth about his father. Finally, Edward realized that all this time he was simply being used, and he was just an obedient puppet in the hands of his own father. Coming out to them, Alfred confirmed their guess, but it was clear to everyone that he did not regret what he had done at all. But what if Henry wanted to lure Alfred here from the very beginning, and this whole fight was set up by him as a skillful trap? Yes, it was very funny to hear that, but even if it was so, it was unlikely that Henry would have been able to defeat Alfred in an open duel. Seeing his new appearance, Agatha shouted loudly that he was the same demon as Edward, but possessed even greater power. But having split the vessel with several magic pills into pieces, Henry had already prepared for such an outcome. There was no doubt that Alfred was an even more powerful opponent than his son, because he had several experienced warriors fighting on his side. Henry had already managed to sense in the recent duel that ominous aura that was now emanating from this monster in human form. This moment could be considered the beginning of that mortal duel, which Henry had been dreaming about more and more often lately. After all, as soon as Alfred used his first ability, the young people immediately felt all the energy emanating from his body. But looking at this powerful man, everyone understood that there was a monster hiding under his shell, because otherwise there was no way to explain such an ominous aura. It seemed as if all the space around him was subject to him, and he could control the same elements as Henry. Knowing her boyfriend's character, Sophia asked him to be more careful and think through a plan before each attack. But it was already useless, since they themselves provoked this open duel, and Alfred was only glad to give them a fight with a real opponent. Suddenly, Henry suddenly declared that he would not allow Richard to carry out his plan, because he knew very well his mission on this earth. He answered without hesitation that he would never allow Henry to interfere with the plan to destroy the world, which was predetermined by fate, and it was not for this young man to decide for the gods. However, now the gods themselves were helping the guy, as all the elements instantly activated and gathered behind Henry. Looking at his father, Edward understood that he had known about this moment from the very beginning, and his own son was just a pawn in the hands of this scoundrel. Of course, all those fighters on Alfred's side could also have turned out to be monsters, only outwardly similar to ordinary people. At the last moment, Henry asked him to come to his senses and remember the parents who gave birth to him, and who certainly did not want to raise a future killer of everything that exists. Yes, this touched Alfred to the quick, although not for long, since it was hardly possible to move someone whose hands were already elbow-deep in blood to pity. And now two irreconcilable rivals, chosen by heaven itself, stood opposite each other, ready to engage in battle. Alfred suddenly declared that he could even take Henry into his clan, and give him a place of honor if the boy remembered his destiny. But now he was not going to listen to this nonsense, because the lives of people had long become his main goal, for which he was reborn in this world. And then, turning to Julia, the guy said with a smile that everything would be as before and he would achieve another victory. Of course, it was nice to hear such confidence in his voice, but the girl understood that he just wanted to cheer her up a little. And then suddenly there was a loud, ominous laugh, and everyone realized that Alfred had begun what he had been preparing for so long. Even Julia, always prepared for any outcome, did not expect who she would actually have to face. All the people behind this man really turned out to be monsters, because their laughter suddenly sounded in a low, inhuman voice. At that moment, the very same ampule with the monster's blood that Richard had already bitten into before the fight with his young rival flashed in Alfred's teeth. Now, he was ready to increase his strength many times over and show these students what he was really capable of. Julia warned the other girls to keep their cool and let her get into the fight first. But Henry still insisted that he should be the first to enter the battle, since Alfred was aiming at him first and foremost. Suddenly, he felt the aura on all sides change, as if Alfred's omnipresent dark energy had spread everywhere. The entire area of the abandoned factory slowly began to turn into one big dark spot due to the ominous energy. The Sky Fox warned that she was wrong when she called the fight with Richard the most difficult in Henry's life, because that very fight would happen right now. But a familiar smile appeared on his face, and the guy assured that he had been preparing for this fight his whole life. Surely the demon remembered very well the dragon essence that Michelle had already released once before the cursed blood had completely bound her body. After all, he looked at the world through the black spot of that creature that appeared in that place, and was the first to enter into a duel with the teacher. But now she could no longer help her friends, since after the manifestation of even one ability, the virus would immediately spread throughout her body again. However, Henry now felt a strength within himself that could match even such a powerful warrior as Alfred. Realizing that the hour had come, the man loudly shouted the command to his fighters for each of them to bite the ampule. After the boys did this, the monster's blood began to activate, spreading through their veins, and each began to take on a sinister appearance. And a few seconds later, instead of those guys, there were already evil mutants who had become puppets in the hands of Alfred. Out of habit, Julia asked the guy to step aside and leave the matter to her, claiming that it was her turn now. It seems that this girl has forgotten who was considered the most outstanding alchemist in the academy, and it's time for her to stop pretending to be a caring mother. Moreover, right now he has another ally who just a few minutes ago was his worst enemy. Then everyone saw before them how Edward gathered the last of his magic and prepared to fight against his father. Today he seemed to have seen the light and realized that all his life he had been chasing a false goal, and had always considered his allies to be his enemies. It's good that he realized this at least now, although he could have done it much earlier, seeing what everything was leading to from the very beginning. But it is unlikely that Henry would refuse his help at the moment when he needed it so much. The guy asked to forget everything that happened between them before, even if he himself behaved a little arrogantly towards Henry. However, this sweet scene seemed to Alfred to be an excellent start to the duel, and he wanted to have his say as soon as possible. Suddenly, seeing the monsters in front of them, all the agents scattered, betraying their own leader. Already running away, one guy shouted to Edward that they had not agreed to fight monsters, and that their lives were too dear to them to stay here. Yes, these unfortunate cowards really did leave the battlefield just when their leader needed them so much. Alfred realized that all this time his son had been a bunch of timid sheep in his service. But he was glad to see the true strength of his foolish son now. And if a guy decided to compete with his father, having such friends, then he could say goodbye to this idea once and for all. Realizing that he could only rely on his own strength, Edward activated an ability that would make these guys change their minds. Immediately after activating this ability, he took control of their bodies, and the boys felt themselves stop right in front of the entrance to the forest. And then an ampule with the monster's blood appeared in the hands of each of them, and after they bit into it and drank the blood, all their former fear would disappear without a trace. If it didn't work the first time, Edward told them to drink 2 ampules at once, and then the effect would be guaranteed. Yes, the guy had no intention of just letting them go home, hoping to quickly replenish the ranks of his army with merciless monsters. The very next second, those guys who had recently cowardly run into the forest began to turn into enraged zombies. Of course, none of them wanted such a fate for themselves, but Edward understood that for the common good, he could easily take such a step. And now some mutants were fighting against others, and Edward found himself right in the thick of this deadly battle. Until recently, it was hard to imagine that monsters could fight against each other, but now such a day has come. After all, some monsters were cutting up others, and at some point it became unclear which mutant was taking whose side in this fight. All the clothes on the bodies of the former agents were torn, and in their place, there remained only enraged monsters who had arranged a bloody meat grinder. The mutants on Alfred's side no longer posed such a threat, since they were fighting with their equals in strength. At some point, the fight between the mutants became so intense that nothing could be seen in the clouds of smoke. Henry was glad that his childhood friend had come to his senses in time, which meant that their battle today had not been in vain. But Alfred understood from the very beginning that this boy was capable of failing even the simplest mission, and had long been prepared for such an outcome. Suddenly, Edward saw Julia walking straight through the crowd of monsters, heading towards their main enemy for the day. Yes, she intended to meet directly with the one who commanded all these monsters and planned the destruction of the world. And now the scene from the past seemed to repeat itself. Only instead of a giant headless monster, Alfred stood in front of the girl, who, if not Henry, knew how Julia's duel ended last time. But the guy already understood that history was changing on the fly. According to an ancient legend, one of the goddesses, who had the ability to tame fire, after death moved into the soul of an ordinary person. And perhaps her soul was reborn from generation to generation in different girls, eventually ending up in Julia's body. But besides the element of fire, that young woman had another ability, because it was not by chance that she was called the Mistress of Dragons. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by the immortal spirit, who suggested that the boy play table tennis with the balls where the power of the elements was concentrated. However, now was no time for childish games, because the hardest battle in Julia's life was unfolding right before their eyes. After all, the prophecy that Henry knew about seemed to be coming true, and several bursts of energy appeared above the girl's head. And then the heavenly dragon, feeling the call, responded and rushed straight towards Julia in the form of lightning. Immediately after this, Everyone saw how a lightning bolt struck directly at her. But they understood that through this energy, God endowed her with his power. It was difficult for her to get through this moment, and it took a lot of effort to endure the pain, but it was all worth it. Even the Heavenly Fox, who had been through a lot in all her previous lives, understood that this young girl was an example for many. Henry only hoped that she would have the fortitude to endure this trial and accept all the mana that she would soon possess. Luckily, after the smoke cleared, the friends saw Julia in front of them. Only this time, she looked completely different. After all, now inside her was a new dragon essence, and with its help the girl intended to enter her most important battle. Alfred understood that now before him stood not a young student, but a deity in the body of a little girl. Soon he had the chance to feel her true power, because immediately after connecting with the spirit, the girl attacked him with a direct blow to the face. From such a blow, Alfred flew far to the side, his body breaking all the stone barriers in his path. Only with difficulty did he manage to stop, clawing at the ground with his claws, although his problems did not end there. After all, Julia was right next to him in a second and, grabbing him by the hair, was ready to continue the fight. And then, firmly grasping his head, she threw him with such force that anyone else in his place would not have gotten back on his feet. After such a blow, the stones flew in different directions, and this surge of powerful energy was noticeable even 10 miles away. Of course, the friends had already guessed that they were dealing with a very strong warrior, but they did not know that Julia would be so powerful. It was strange that Henry hadn't told Edward about this before, although the guy reminded him that they had been feuding all this time. Trying to get to his feet, Alfred realized that his entire group of fighters was almost defeated, and he had only one thing left to do. And then, having bitten into the ampule with the monster's blood, he suddenly roared so loudly like a beast that the voice of an enraged beast was heard throughout the entire area. A second later, instead of him, Henry saw in front of him a huge mutant, into which Alfred had turned. Sophia couldn't believe that this cursed blood was capable of causing such a transformation of the body, and it was difficult to imagine how to fight this monster now. Of course, Alfred could never become an ordinary person again, because having taken such a dose of cursed blood, he cut off his path of retreat. It is unknown whether Alfred himself understood this, since the dark force took over not only his body, but also completely enslaved his consciousness. He waved his huge paws around wildly, but Julia was already ready for his next attack. Putting her hands forward, she was able to catch his powerful blow and did something she could not have thought of before. After all, this fragile girl managed to hold the hand of the enraged giant, although it was clear that she herself was already at the limit of her strength. At some point, Henry realized that this could not last long, and Julia's powers were also limited by her physical body. But she stood up to the giant so bravely that anyone nearby would have wanted to immediately join in this duel. Even when the monster raised its giant hand, the girl still held onto it, and the dragon's power swirled around her like a fiery whirlwind. She was so brave that even the mutant did not expect such a reaction. But the next second, the girl threw him aside with all her strength. And now this ugly giant flew to the other end of the forest, surprised to realize that he was weaker than this fragile girl. But it was unlikely that Julia could now seem so fragile to anyone as to underestimate the strength of this young warrior. The giant meanwhile hit his back against the wall, and with his entire mass almost broke through it. But he didn't intend to end the fight there, especially since the girl had already spent too much mana at the very beginning. He was prepared for her to try to finish him off, but Julia wasn't experienced enough to figure it out. After all, when she was very close, the monster suddenly jumped up from his place and hit her with his giant hand with his entire body weight. After such a blow, the girl fell into the rubble of the building, and this picture strongly resembled her fight with the alien in her past life. The monster meanwhile pushed off the ground with force and found itself high in the air ready to deliver its finishing blow. This time, he wanted to leave her no chance and finish Julia off before she could gather her strength. Seeing her small figure below, he activated dark magic and headed down with all his speed. Right in mid-flight, a claw suddenly appeared from his body, and it was this claw that he wanted to plunge at full speed straight into Julia's head. Surely in another case it could have worked. But this time, instead of a blow, he received such damage that it was difficult to recover from. After all, his right arm was torn to pieces and black monster blood flowed from the wound. Meanwhile, Julia was keeping a close eye on her opponent and was ready to strike the next blow. Looking at the armless giant, Henry understood that these creatures had a high ability to regenerate, and it would not be surprising if Alfred restored the body. And indeed, after a few seconds, dark energy suddenly began to flow out of that stump of rotting meat that made up the monster's body. And then the mutant suddenly realized that his ability was working perfectly, and he saw his lost hand again. It seemed that all of Julia's cheap tricks weren't working against him, and the monster was ready to take revenge on this arrogant girl. But Julia was not one to retreat from danger and responded by throwing another stream of powerful energy at the monster. This flame was capable of burning anyone to ashes, and once under it, the monster began to slowly fly apart into small pieces. The remains of his giant body fell to the ground, and for a while everything around became silent. Only half of his body lay below, and now only his legs and torso remained of the former giant. Looking closely into the distance, the girl realized with horror that even such an attack could not bring her victory. After all, half of the mutant suddenly began to move, and a second later was able to rise to its feet, heading towards the girl. From the outside, it looked a little funny, as if a body without a head and arms was walking around in the fresh air in the shade of the trees. But when the regeneration process was completely completed, Julia was no longer laughing, because she saw the same giant monster in front of her. The girl had no choice but to use her last strength, and she immediately gathered another stream of fiery energy in her hand. But the next moment she suddenly realized that she had spent too much energy, and black blood even gushed out of her mouth. At that moment, Henry realized that the past was partly repeating itself, because it was Julia who died at the hands of a giant monster on that fateful day. Looking at her, he understood that he would never allow this terrible story to be repeated, and was ready to intervene. And now she was surprised to see that the guy wanted to take a risk and fight a monster that seemed impossible to kill with any magic. Yes, Henry understood that all the dark forces, concentrated in one single being, were now fighting against him. Although it was unlikely that Alfred could be called a human now, because instead of him, there was an enraged giant mutant, surrounded by a whirlwind of destructive force. At one point, he let out such a loud animal roar that Henry's ears were blocked by the sound. However, after this, Henry loudly called for help from all the gods who were able to hear him and give him strength. The monster understood that their abilities were approximately equal, and he had underestimated the power of this alchemist from the very beginning. However, he did not take into account that Frank and his daughter, to whom the guy had rendered an invaluable service, were now on Henry's side. Only recently Henry managed to get the disabled man he first saw Frank back on his feet. And now this powerful warrior realized that the time had come to remember his youth and show all his strength in practice. One of his main weapons were those sacred artifacts that instantly burst out from under the ground at his call. Instead of a flat surface, the giant saw several magical artifacts in front of him, surrounding him on all sides like a solid wall. These stone slabs usually served as a barrier, but now magical heavy chains were directed from them towards the monster. The giant was then wrapped in these chains and could not move, because his hands were tied and the ability of dark energy became inaccessible to him. And then, looking back at Julia, Henry told her that she had another chance to carry out her attack. The guy understood that this girl dreamed of taking revenge for her past, and it seemed that now was the time to act. Understanding him at a glance, Julia again headed straight towards the giant, ending up in the air opposite his head. And that fiery energy, given to her by the dragon, was now supposed to become the final force that would forever calm this monster. The next moment, hellish flames surrounded the mutant from all sides, but he could no longer escape, still held on all sides by chains. Then the chains squeezed him so hard that his body began to burst before his eyes and bleed black blood. Unable to withstand such an onslaught, the monster fell down, right into the place where the hellish flames were already raging. Looking at this, Frank understood that victory was closer than ever, but now there was only one last thing to do. Realizing what needed to be done, his daughter commanded her men to immediately rush into the attack and finish off the remaining Alfred mutants. The guys didn't keep us waiting long, because Frank's team included some of the best magicians from the entire empire. Of course, the monsters also tried to resist, and many members of Frank's group died, knowing that they were fighting for all of humanity. It was hard to watch as monsters attacked the agents from all sides, but not everyone would be lucky enough to survive that day. But then something happened that stopped this fight forever and left no doubt about its outcome. After all, the powerful explosion that thundered in that place blew to pieces all the mutants who were still trying to resist. And now, no monster could escape their fate, as each of them burned in this hellish flame. After a while, the noise died down, and the mutant, who had recently been human, realized that his mission was accomplished. It was this guy that Edward ordered to be the first to drink the monster's blood, and he fought on the side of light throughout the entire duel. But now, looking at this emptiness, it was hard to believe that they had finally managed to prevent the terrible fate of fate. It was difficult to come to terms with the loss of the best fighters, but Ralph understood perfectly well that the price of this victory was very high. For a while, no one could say a word, and one could easily understand these people who looked into the eyes of their death. Alfred remained in the guise of a dead monster, from whose body only one head remained on the ground. Once again, Frank was convinced of the true power of this young student, who was not only an alchemist, but also an excellent warrior. Henry was ready to respond in kind, and they both bowed respectfully to each other as a sign of their eternal friendship. However, Frank noted that, knowing the abilities of these monsters, it was unlikely that Alfred would be killed permanently. And indeed, soon the mutant's ability to regenerate manifested itself again, and the usual giant body appeared in place of the head. But even if they had to fight side by side with Henry against the aliens forever, everyone was ready to be on his team until the last drop of blood. Suddenly, Julia noticed Edward nearby, who had finally made the right choice and cast aside his vanity. True, among them there was one girl who was not ready to simply forgive this scoundrel for everything he had done. Realizing that Catherine was heading towards him, the guy loudly apologized at the last moment and asked her not to do it. But it was already too late, and the fragile girl delivered a resounding slap to the one who had long deserved punishment. But the guy had already asked for forgiveness, and Henry repeated that he hadn't held any grudges against him for a long time. Indeed, Henry knew in advance that his childhood friend was just a puppet in his father's hands, so Edward could not be blamed for everything. However, if he tries to do something like that next time, Henry won't stop Catherine. But right now they had to deal with the last problem, because the mutated Alfred's body was still nearby. He remembered that in his past life, Edward had gone so far that he had once pierced his father with a sacred blade. But now everything had changed, and this guy was no longer that arrogant kid who did everything just for the glory. He solemnly swore to serve in the name of saving humanity, and was willing to remain in the shadow of the one who truly deserved glory. He suddenly looked forward and shouted loudly to make Henry turn around and see for himself what was happening behind him. It seems that the day has come when the main prophecy of antiquity, and the reason why Henry was reborn into this world, was coming true. After all, looking at the sky, the monster understood that a terrible force was approaching here, against which neither Henry nor his friends could resist. And then everyone realized with horror that this monster had no intention of dying, but was only becoming stronger with every second. It was hard to tell where he was getting his energy from, but the demon himself was probably already too close to them. Most likely the fight with Richard and all the other duels were a series of diversionary maneuvers of the creature that would soon appear on Earth. Alfred confirmed his guess, stating that even if they cut him into pieces, he would still regain his appearance. But he didn't take into account that Henry was ready for this too, answering the monster that he was ready to fight him even 1,000 times. However, what would this guy say about fighting not with him, but with his master, that same dark creature? It seemed he wanted to scare the young alchemist with this, but Henry replied with a smile that it was completely useless. Besides, it was not his place to tell horror stories now, since the giant's body was still chained. But it was at this moment that what the prophecy had predicted happened, and the mutant's aura suddenly intensified tenfold. And then, in all directions from his bloody body, magical circles began to spread, heralding the beginning of the main battle. These waves of dark power reached the capital of the empire, and finally reached the place where the dark entity resided. The demon's servants, realizing that the moment had come, each took out a bottle of demon blood, ready to carry out the order. And then they drank this blood and slowly began to turn into those zombies that Henry had already encountered in battle more than once. Only this time, each of the giants had the same strength as Alfred, in the battle with whom he had to use all his abilities. The weapons of these monsters were artifacts that already contained destructive energy, and it became clear that the last battle would be much more serious than the others. But suddenly each of the mutants pierced their flesh with this artifact, and black blood sprayed in all directions. It turned out that they were all following an order, the execution of which triggered the beginning of a ritual arranged by a dark force. These obedient puppets were gathered in a circle, in the center of which was a dark altar, where the demon himself was soon to appear. Immediately after the ritual was completed, the entire sky was covered with dark matter, and the demon finally completed his preparations before personally stepping onto the earth. The inhabitants of the empire immediately noticed the black sky and lightning, which looked more like magical discharges sent from the heavens by death itself. There was no one left in the city who did not notice this, and Henry's parents thought with horror about where their children were now. In the very center of the city, a terrible tornado suddenly began, exactly repeating the first day of the invasion that Henry had been trying to prevent since his rebirth. The ritual was supposed to end with the touch of dark energy by a human hand, and this event did not take long to happen. Immediately after this, the dark gates in heaven opened, and all the demon's servants appeared on Earth from the magical whirlpool. After the burst of energy, magical beams filled the ground, and one of them, hitting Alfred, instantly destroyed the shackles holding him. And then he realized that his arms and legs were now completely free, which meant he could get up and resume the fight. And so it happened, and soon the giant broke all the iron chains on his body and was ready to rise to his full height in front of these little people below. It was hard to imagine what kind of power the demon himself must have if even his slaves displayed such powerful energy. Just recently, Julia gave all her strength in this fight, but unfortunately even this was not enough to defeat the evil spirits. Frank had never seen anything like it in his life, and now he realized that the ancient prophecy had come true. After all, in front of them stood not just a zombie, but a giant monster, which became even larger and its ominous dark energy increased tenfold. Henry was prepared for anything and told his frightened friend with a smile that he had long warned him how difficult their final fight would be. But as before, he was ready to go through at least 1,000 battles, because this was his main goal, for which he was able to be reborn and appear again in this world. Henry was right, because the dark creatures had already filled almost the entire capital. And now the demon understood that the hour of retribution had come. Nothing held him back anymore. And seeing what people had turned this world into, he was ready to appear on Earth again, and remind who is the creator and the only owner of all that exists.